Clara stood paralyzed in the center of the charred office, the smell of gasoline and singed mahogany choking the air as the syndicate's office burned around her. In her trembling hands, she clutched a leather ledger that should have been her salvation. But the page she just turned to felt like a death sentence. It wasn't just a record of stolen water. It was a blackmail file detailing a hit-and-run her brother Julian had committed years ago. A crime her father had spent his final days paying to keep buried. Outside, the roar of bulldozers drowned out the crackle of the flames. And through the smoke, she saw her trusted Uncle Mateo standing calmly beside the men who had come to bulldoze her family's legacy into the dirt. As a heavy beam crashed behind her, sending a spray of orange sparks across her skin, Clara realized the terrifying truth. Her family wasn't being hunted by outsiders. The predators had been sitting at her dinner table for decades, with the exit blocked by private security and the local police in the syndicate's pocket. She looked down at the ledger one last time. There was one name scrawled in the margins of the final page, a name that changed everything she knew about why her father really died. She had no allies, no legal standing, and less than 60 seconds before the roof collapsed. But she knew if she could just reach the courthouse, she wouldn't just save the farm. She would burn the entire county to the ground. Oh, the valve groaned under Clara's grip, its rusted edges biting into her palms. She twisted harder, the metal screaming in protest, but the mechanism refused to budge. A bead of sweat traced the curve of her spine, soaking into the faded cotton of her shirt. The sun hung low and merciless, turning the air thick as syrup. She could taste the salt of her own exhaustion, the bitter tang of failure already coating her tongue. The orchard stretched before her, a graveyard of withering trees. Their leaves curled inward, brittle as old parchment, their branches sagging under the weight of unripe fruit. The scent of decay clung to everything, the damp earth, the rotting peaches left to ferment in the grass, the sour tang of her own desperation. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, smearing dirt across her skin. The irrigation line was more than just plumbing. It was the carotid artery of the Jenkins estate. And right now, it was pulsing with nothing but air and rust. If she didn't get the water flowing, the high-sugar Valencia oranges would shrivel into bitter husks before the week was out. She leaned her entire weight into the wrench, her boots sliding in the dry, dusty topsoil. Every muscle in her forearms cordoned into tight, aching knots. This land had been a Jenkins promise for 3 generations, a legacy of citrus and sweat. But as the metal refused to give, Clara felt the weight of that history pressing down like a tombstone. The silence of the grove was eerie, broken only by the frantic, dry rasp of cicadas that seemed to mock her struggle. She closed her eyes for a second, pressing her thumb into the scar on her eyebrow, trying to summon the ghost of her father's strength. He would have known exactly where to strike the pipe to make it yield. But he was gone, buried under 6 feet of the very soil that was now turning into a parched, unforgiving enemy. A movement at the periphery of the grove caught her attention, a splash of sharp, clinical white against the dusty green of the trees. Clara straightened, her back popping in a rhythmic, painful sequence. A man in a stiff, short-sleeved dress shirt stood by the perimeter fence, his polished shoes looking absurdly out of place against the mud-caked grass. He held a clipboard like a shield, his pen tapping against the plastic board with a slow, deliberate rhythm that grated against her raw nerves. The sun glinted off his wire-rimmed glasses, obscuring his eyes and making him look like some predatory insect. He wasn't a neighbor, and he certainly wasn't a buyer. He had the unmistakable air of a man who dealt in foreclosures and final notices. Clara watched him circle the farmhouse, his head tilting as he noted the sagging porch and the peeling paint of the shutters. He moved with a cold, administrative grace, oblivious to the scent of overripe fruit or the desperate heat. To him, this wasn't a home or a legacy. It was a line item on a spreadsheet, a collection of assets to be liquidated. The stone in Clara's stomach grew heavier, cold and jagged. She knew what he was. The county assessor's office had been sending letters for months, each one more shrill than the last. But seeing him here, physically measuring the distance to her front door, made the threat of financial ruin feel tactile, like a noose tightening around her neck. She dropped the wrench into the dirt with a dull thud and began the long walk back toward the farmhouse, her legs feeling like lead. The house loomed ahead, a wood-frame structure that seemed to be huddling into itself, exhausted by the heat. She needed to find the receipts, the proof that the last tax payment had been mailed, even if she knew the check had probably bounced like a rubber ball. She bypassed the man, ignoring his attempt to catch her eye, and slipped through the back door. The air inside was stagnant, smelling of old wood and the faint, lingering ghost of her father's pipe tobacco. She headed straight for his office, a small, cramped room off the main hallway that remained a shrine to a man who believed hard work could outrun fate. The mahogany roll-top desk sat in the corner, a massive, brooding presence. It was locked, as it had been since the day they carried him out of the house. Clara fumbled with the heavy brass key, her fingers shaking just enough to make the task difficult. When the slats finally slid back, they revealed a chaotic landscape of yellowed invoices, faded maps of the grove, and stacks of unpaid bills that her father had hidden with the same diligence he had used to prune the trees. She began to tear through the drawers, her movements becoming more frantic as she heard the auditor's footsteps on the porch. The receipts had to be here. They were the only thing that could buy her another week, another day, another hour of belonging to this soil. The bottom drawer was stuck, jammed by some unseen obstruction. Clara yanked at it, her frustration boiling over into a silent, white-hot rage. She thought of the man outside, the dying trees, and the way the bank had started calling her Ms. Jenkins, with a tone that suggested she was already a ghost. She pulled again, and when it didn't budge, she slammed her fist down onto the top of the desk. The impact vibrated through her arm, but it also triggered a sharp, mechanical click. A small, hidden panel at the rear of the desk popped open, revealing a shallow compartment she had never known existed. Inside lay a weathered leather ledger, its cover cracked and stained with age, looking like something that had been pulled from the hold of a shipwreck. She reached in, her breath hitching in her throat, and pulled the book out. This wasn't a standard accounting ledger. It was thick, hand-bound, and filled with her father's dense, sloping script. As she flipped the first few pages, her eyes didn't land on tax receipts. Instead, she saw lists of names she recognized: local officials, the land commissioner, and representatives of the Everglades Development Syndicate. The dates went back years, long before the drought had started, long before the accidents had begun to plague the neighboring farms. This was a record of secrets, a chronicle of a slow-motion theft that her father had documented in the shadows of his own office. The heavy thud of a boot on the floorboards behind her made her spin around. It wasn't the auditor. Standing in the doorway was Deputy Miller, a man whose badge was pinned to a shirt that looked too tight for his broad, sweating chest. He didn't offer a greeting. He held a legal-sized envelope out, like a weapon. "Clara," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl that carried no warmth. "I'm here to serve an immediate eviction notice. You've got till sundown to clear out. The syndicate's taken possession of the deed." Clara clutched the ledger to her chest, her knuckles white. "This is my house, Miller. My father's house. You can't just walk in here with a piece of paper and tell me it's gone." Miller's eyes flickered to the leather book in her hands, and his expression shifted from boredom to a sharp, predatory interest. He stepped into the room, his hand resting on the grip of his service weapon. "That's a nice-looking book you got there, Clara. Why don't you hand it over? Might make things easier for you when the moving trucks show up." He moved with a sudden, surprising speed for a man of his size, reaching out to snatch the ledger. Clara twisted away, her shoulder hitting the edge of the desk. She realized then that Miller wasn't here just to serve a notice. He was an enforcer, a man hired to clean up the loose ends that her father had left behind. The struggle was brief and ugly. Miller lunged again, his fingers catching the corner of the ledger, and for a second, they were locked in a grim tug-of-war. He was stronger, his breath hot and sour against her face. But Clara was fueled by a desperate, ancestral territoriality. She felt the heavy brass paperweight under her hand, a solid, eagle-shaped lump of metal her father had used for 40 years. She didn't think. She simply swung. The metal connected with Miller's shoulder with a sickening thud. He let out a sharp grunt of pain and recoiled, his hand dropping from the book. Clara didn't wait for him to recover. She ducked under his arm, bolted through the door, and slammed it shut, sliding the heavy iron bolt into place just as Miller threw his weight against the wood. The office was now a cage, but it was a cage that bought her time. She could hear him cursing on the other side, the sound of his shoulder hitting the door muffled by the thick oak. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scrambled back to the desk, the ledger shaking in her hands. She had to know. She had to see why a deputy would risk a physical assault for a book of old notes. She flipped to the most recent entries, her eyes scanning the columns of figures. Her breath caught. There, in the middle of a page detailing a series of high-interest loans, was a signature she would know anywhere. Julian Jenkins, her brother, the man who had moved to the city to make something of himself, had been signing his name to the very documents that were dismantling their family's life. He hadn't just been a failure. He had been a scout for the syndicate, feeding them the financial vulnerabilities of the orchard like meat to a shark. He had sold her out for a percentage of a development deal that hadn't even been built yet. The sound of a heavy engine rumbling up the driveway drew her to the window. A brand-new charcoal-gray Ford F-250 pulled to a stop, its chrome accents gleaming in the harsh sun. The truck cost more than Clara made in 3 years of harvests. The door opened, and Mateo stepped out, looking every bit the concerned uncle in his snap-button shirt and polished boots. He looked up at the house, a practiced expression of sympathy on his weathered face. But Clara saw the way he glanced at the truck, a subtle, possessive pat on the door as he closed it. Mateo, the man who had sat at her father's funeral and promised to look out for her, was driving the blood money of her orchard. She watched him from behind the curtain, her mind racing. The luxury of that vehicle was a confession. A man whose own groves were supposedly failing didn't buy a $60,000 truck unless he had found a new, darker source of income. Miller was still pounding on the office door, his threats becoming more frantic. But Clara felt a strange, icy calm settle over her. The romanticized history she had built in her head, the story of the noble Jenkins family struggling against the elements, was a lie. The predators weren't just at the gates. They were her own blood, her own kin, sitting at her table and smiling while they sharpened the knife. She was alone. Truly alone. The realization didn't break her. It hardened her. She looked down at the scarred orange she had plucked from the tree earlier, its skin pitted and tough. It was a survivor, just like her. She tucked the ledger into the waistband of her jeans, pulling her flannel shirt down to hide the bulk. If they wanted this land, they were going to have to bury her in it. She turned away from the door, looking at the narrow window that led to the porch roof. She wouldn't wait for Miller to break through. She wouldn't wait for Mateo to offer his poisoned comfort. She was going into the groves, into the one place where she knew every shadow and every trench. The fight for the Jenkins orchard had only just begun. The descent from the porch roof was a jarring reminder of her age, the impact vibrating through her ankles as she hit the sandy soil. She didn't look back at the house, even as she heard Miller finally splinter the office door upstairs. She moved through the overgrown brush of the backyard, her boots silent on the carpet of pine needles, and vanished into the first row of grapefruit trees. The air here was 10 degrees hotter, trapped by the canopy, smelling of scorched earth and the metallic tang of the irrigation pipes. She headed toward the town, toward the bank. She had a few $100s left in her savings, enough for a lawyer, enough for a fighting chance. But when she reached the local branch of the county trust, the air inside was even colder than the assessor's office. The teller, a woman Clara had gone to high school with, wouldn't look her in the eye. "I'm sorry, Clara," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "There's a hold on the account. Legal department. Something about an outstanding lien from the syndicate." Clara felt the world tilt. They had moved faster than she had anticipated, cutting off her oxygen before she could even draw a breath. She stood in the middle of the sterile lobby, a woman in dirt-stained work clothes, realizing that her money wasn't hers anymore. It was just another asset they had swallowed. Desperation drove her to the pickers' camp on the edge of the property. These were men and women who had worked for her father for decades. People who knew the rhythm of the Jenkins harvest better than their own heartbeats. Surely they would stand with her. But as she walked between the small sun-bleached trailers, the atmosphere was different. Conversations died as she approached. Heads turned away. When she found the foreman, a man named Hector, who had once carried her on his shoulders through the groves, he wouldn't meet her gaze. "We can't help you, Clara," he said, his voice flat with a fear she had never seen in him. "The men in the black SUVs, they came yesterday. They said anyone helping the Jenkins woman would never work in this county again. We have families." The isolation was a physical weight. A cold wind blowing through the humid Florida afternoon. She walked back toward her property lines, the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows through the trees. When she reached the porch, she whistled for her dog, a scruffy terrier mix that usually met her at the gate with a frantic, joyous bark. Silence. She whistled again, her heart beginning to hammer. She found his collar on the top step. It hadn't been slipped. The buckle was undone, lying there like a discarded skin. The message was clear. Nothing she loved was safe. She retreated to the barn, the darkness of the interior offering a temporary sanctuary. She needed to move the portable water tank to the North Grove manually if the valves wouldn't turn. She climbed into the seat of the old Massey Ferguson tractor, the metal hot against her skin. She turned the key, the engine coughing to life with a familiar, rhythmic roar. But as she shifted into gear and depressed the brake to steady the machine, the pedal went soft, sinking all the way to the floorboard without a hint of resistance. The tractor lurched forward, nearly pinning her against the barn wall before she managed to kill the ignition. She climbed down, her hands shaking, and crawled into the dirt to look beneath the chassis. The brake lines hadn't snapped. They had been sliced with a clean, surgical precision. The realization that they were trying to kill her, not just evict her, but end her, was the final spark. She didn't go back to the house. She went to the packing house, the massive, corrugated metal structure where the fruit was processed. She knew Julian would be there, overseeing the inventory of his new kingdom. She found him in the office, feet up on the desk, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He looked up as she burst in, his expression shifting from surprise to a weary, condescending smirk. "Clara," he said, "you look like hell. Why don't you just take the settlement money and go to the coast? This place is dead." "I found the ledger, Julian," she said, her voice dropping to that low, dangerous register. "I saw your name. I saw what you did to Dad's accounts. And I know about the water." Julian's smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stillness. He didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. He just reached for a radio on the desk. "You should have stayed in the house, Clara. Now you're just making this difficult for everyone." Two men in dark security uniforms stepped out from behind the sorting machinery, their faces as blank as stones. Julian nodded toward her. "Take her to the back. We'll wait for the boss to decide how to handle a trespasser." Clara didn't wait to be grabbed. She spun around and sprinted toward the loading bays, her boots echoing on the concrete. The guards were younger and faster, their footsteps a rhythmic drumming behind her. She dived through a half-open bay door, the humid night air hitting her like a wall. She didn't stick to the paths. She dived into the deep irrigation trenches that ran like scars through the groves. The guards' flashlights cut through the darkness, long white fingers of light searching the canopy. But Clara was a ghost in the mud. She knew where the ground dipped, where the roots of the old lemon trees created natural hollows. She listened to them crashing through the brush, their curses echoing in the still air. And she felt a grim satisfaction as she heard one of them stumble into a hidden drainage pipe. She ended up in the old pump house, a rusted shack at the far end of the property that hadn't been used in a decade. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of grease and stagnant water. She huddled in the corner, clicking on a small pen light. She pulled out the ledger and began to study the maps her father had drawn. They weren't just grove layouts. They were geological surveys, marked with red ink. She traced the lines and realized the truth. The syndicate wasn't just buying land for a resort. They were building a massive underground diversion system, tapping into the county's primary aquifer and siphoning the water toward their own developments while starving the independent groves. It was a water heist on a massive scale, and the Jenkins orchard was the final piece of the puzzle. She found a coded entry at the bottom of the map. A list of payments made to an account labeled M.R. Mateo Rivera. Her Tio hadn't just been a middleman. He had been the one who pointed out the weak points in the irrigation system, the one who told the syndicate exactly where to dig to kill the trees. As she watched from the small, salt-crusted window of the pump house, she saw a black SUV pull up to the edge of the grove. Mateo stepped out, followed by the syndicate leader, a man in a tailored suit who looked like he belonged on a yacht, not in a dying orange grove. They spoke in low tones, Mateo gesturing toward the very pump house where Clara was hiding. The betrayal was complete. Every hand she had ever held was now a fist aimed at her heart. The night deepened, the humidity turning into a thick, clinging fog that obscured the stars. Clara knew she couldn't stay in the pump house forever. She had to get to the county seat, to the land commissioner's office. But the phone call she made to her only remaining ally, a lawyer named David who had been her father's friend, shattered that hope. He answered on the third ring, his voice shaking. "Clara, don't call here again. They were at my house. They know about the ledger. If I help you, I lose everything. I'm sorry." The line went dead, the dial tone a funeral dirge in her ear. She was legally, financially, and socially erased. The next morning, the local news carried a brief, chilling announcement. The county land commissioner had scheduled an emergency hearing for dawn the following day to rezone the Jenkins orchard. They were moving at light speed now, bypassing the usual months of bureaucracy to finalize the theft before she could find a voice. Clara watched the broadcast on a battery-powered radio in the pump house, her jaw set. She had one move left, and it was a suicide mission. She had to get into the syndicate's temporary headquarters, a high-security trailer parked on the county line, and find the bank statements that would tie the water diversion to the commissioner himself. She scouts the perimeter for hours, moving like a coyote through the palmetto scrub. The trailer is surrounded by chain link and guarded by men who don't look like local deputies. They look like mercenaries. But she finds a flaw, a ventilation duct on the roof that hasn't been properly secured. She waits until the guard's shift changes, her heart a drum in her ears, and makes her move. Climbing the fence is a silent, agonizing process, the wire biting into her hands. But she reaches the roof and slides into the duct. The interior of the trailer is a high-tech contrast to her rusted world, filled with servers and glowing monitors. She finds the safe behind a framed map of the Florida coastline. She tries her father's birthday, 04/12/42, and the heavy steel door clicks open with a soft, mechanical sigh. Inside are the original bank statements. The smoking gun that shows the commissioner's family members are the primary shareholders in the shell companies buying the land. She is stuffing the papers into her jacket when the door to the trailer swings open. Mateo and the syndicate leader walk in, their conversation dying mid-sentence as they see her standing over the open safe. "Clara," Mateo says, and for the first time, there is real sorrow in his voice. "You should have just let it go." The fight is desperate and cramped. Mateo lunges for her, his weight slamming her against the metal wall. In the struggle, a portable kerosene heater is kicked over, the fuel igniting instantly against the pile of blueprints on the floor. The trailer becomes an oven in seconds. Clara fights with a feral intensity, her elbow connecting with Mateo's throat, giving her just enough time to kick out the reinforced glass window. She leaps into the dirt as the trailer explodes behind her, a ball of orange flame lighting up the pre-dawn sky. She rolls into the brush, clutching the singed papers to her chest. As she flees through the smoke, she stops for a second to catch her breath and looks at a page of the ledger that had been stuck together by heat. The charred paper reveals a final, devastating truth. Her father hadn't just been a victim. He had been a man living under a shadow. Julian had killed a boy in a hit-and-run 15 years ago, and the syndicate's predecessor had caught it on film. Her father had spent the last decade of his life paying blackmail, bleeding the orchard dry to keep his son out of prison. The accidents weren't just business. They were the interest on a debt of blood. She retreats to the heart of her grove, the sun beginning to bleed over the horizon. But the escape is cut off. The roar of heavy machinery fills the air. Bulldozers, massive yellow beasts, are lined up at her gate. Private security teams have formed a perimeter, their rifles glinting in the early light. She's trapped in the very center of her kingdom, surrounded by the ghosts of her father's secrets and the cold steel of her brother's betrayal. Everything she fought for is gone. The land is a crime scene, and she is the only witness left alive. But Clara Jenkins doesn't lie down. She remembers the old drainage tunnels, the concrete-lined passages her grandfather had built to handle the hurricane floods. They are narrow, slick with algae, and half-collapsed, but they run all the way to the storm drains under the county courthouse. She crawls into the dark, the smell of stagnant water and earth filling her lungs, moving by touch and memory. She emerges 5 blocks from the courthouse, her clothes scorched, her skin caked in mud, looking like a woman who has risen from the grave. She bursts into the courtroom just as the land commissioner is raising his gavel to finalize the rezoning. The room falls into a stunned, vacuum-like silence as she marches down the center aisle. Miller and the security teams try to move toward her, but Clara holds up the water permits, her voice ringing out with a clarity that cuts through the bureaucratic fog. "This isn't a rezoning," she shouts. "It's a heist. Here are the permits for the diversion, signed by the commissioner. paid for by the syndicate. The revelation is like a match in a dry grove. The room erupts. The local farmers, seeing the proof that their own wells were being bled dry by the man they had elected, turn their fury on the bench. The commissioner's face goes the color of ash as federal agents, who had been quietly building a case for months and only needed the physical link, step out from the back of the room to take control. In the chaos, Julian tries to slip out a side door, but Clara is there. She doesn't hit him. She doesn't scream. She just looks at him with a pity that is more devastating than any blow. I know about the boy, Julian. Dad died trying to save a man who wasn't worth the dirt he walked on. Julian's face breaks, the mask of the city's success crumbling into the terrified boy he had always been. He turns and runs, a fugitive from a past he can no longer outrun. Mateo is led away in handcuffs, his eyes downcast, his luxury truck already being impounded as evidence. Clara returns to her orchard that evening. The bulldozers are gone, their treads leaving deep, ugly scars in the soil. But the land is still hers. The air is cooling, the humidity finally breaking into a soft, evening breeze. She stands in the center of the grove, looking at the trees. They are dying, yes, but the water is coming back. The legal victory is hers, but the work is just beginning. She picks up a single scarred orange from the dirt, a fruit that had survived the drought, the fire, and the theft. She peels it, the sharp, sweet scent of citrus filling the air, and takes a bite. It is bitter, tough, and real, just like the future she has won for herself. She is the last Jenkins standing, and for the first time in her life, she is standing on honest ground.